So welcome to How to Be a Better Player panel. We are here today on Sunday morning. It is early. We know this. All of us have our caffeine or other substitute. My name is Ann Ratchett, and my pronouns are she/ze. I will be moderating this panel today. If any questions come up over the course of the play, they will be delegated to the end of the panel for any additional time. But please, in capital letters, put question at the beginning so I can shuffle through whatever comes into play over the course of the chat, if you have anything that comes to mind or you want to talk about. And with that, I'll pass it on to our panelists. So we're going to start off with Tomer.
Hello, my name is Tomer, Tomer Garantz. You can also call me Tomes. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm here at Strategicon. I run games on demand here. So this panel is pseudo hosted by us. And thank you, Anne, so much for volunteering to run it and to host this thing. And I'll pass it over to...
Can I actually have you explain one more thing?
Yeah.
Give a little bit of an explanation of your playstyle background.
Oh, sure. That's a good question. I actually started when I was younger. I was a kid, maybe 8 or 9. Someone introduced me to D&D, friend of the family. We died in a couple seconds being pushed into a pit by skeletons, and I was hooked. I guarantee you, if I added up all the hours that I played versus made characters, I probably made characters more during my youth and played these games. Then there was a big break and I came back and I got really into story games, if you want to use that word, kind of like very narrative heavy, kind of mechanic light, like that's the direction I lean. And I love the very kind of interactive elements between the characters, but specifically like a lot of the kind of open-ended exploratory story stuff. I love it when the story in the game is giving me questions and very directed, maybe leading questions, and we're kind of figuring it all out as we go and play to find out. I think that would sum it up. You want me to pass it off to somebody else?
Yes, go on.
Sure, I'll give it to Mendez.
Yo, what's good? I'm Mendez. I use he, him pronouns, and I live in the greater New York metropolitan area, and I started playing RPGs in college. I think the first game I ever actually, I did also have lots of AD&D books when I was a child that I got from the used section at Borders, because Borders existed, this bookstore. And I spent many lonely hours making characters and not doing anything with them. But then I got to college, my roommate got me into the World of Darkness games. So the first game I ever played was probably, it was Mage the Ascension. And since then, I've transitioned mostly into doing like indie and story games, and some LARPs, especially like really weird LARPs, like Nordic style, American freeform, any 3 people crying in an empty room kind of thing. I like those a lot. I also like character optimization, like min-maxing and power gaming and stuff. I think that's fun also sometimes.
And with that, I think we can pass it on to Amr.
I'm Amr Emirates. I use they them pronouns. I have no caffeine, just a stubborn will to stay awake. Trying to pick what else I used to say. I've been
Playstyle.
games, yeah. I didn't remember if there's anything before that, but I think that's good for now. I've been playing games for about 3 years and a few months now. Started because one of my college friends had bought the Pathfinder Red Box at a yard sale. We promptly then ignored that, and I spent the entire campaign running things off of PFSRD, frantically searching for random stuff as it popped up. I then moved on to indie games. I started realizing that the playstyle my friends wanted from Pathfinder was fun for a bit, but wasn't necessarily what I wanted from games, especially as a runner of games. So I moved on to story games and started playing a lot more narrative-driven and centric games. things like Powered by the Apocalypse and Firebrands, and systems where it's all about the characters and the drama and the mechanics support or complicate that in whatever way. I also do enjoy, I do game design stuff and mostly in that realm, but I have this weird thing where I love tactical video games, but I haven't really had a fun time playing tactical tabletop games just because they haven't hit the itches I've wanted. So I've decided to start making one. That's it. That's my self.
Mhm. So starting off with Amr, what is the role of a player?
Okay. I mean, the cheesy or like kiki answer is to have fun. Um, right? Like I think everyone at the table is there to have fun, and the role of the player, which is every person, including the game master, is to have fun. But specifically, I think it's to figure out what the group sees as fun and then to play into that. I don't think there's one right answer for every group. For me, for example, the way that I enjoy having fun is to basically put a spotlight on the other characters' stories and to highlight the relationships there because that's fun for me, and that usually is fun for the other people at the table because they bring stuff that they want highlighted. Um, so like I think it's have fun for yourself and enhance the fun of others.
Moving on to Tomer.
I guess the way I think about it is kind of like thinking about the question, like, what's the role of a friend? Like that's kind of my approach when I sit at the table. And admittingly, like a lot of times you go to a public space, whether it's a convention or a meetup, and you don't know these people. So, saying what's a role of a friend is going to kind of depend on a lot of factors. But if I'm trying to make a friend, if I'm playing with friends, I want to include them. I want to have a good time with them. Fun sometimes means lots of different things. So like 3 people crying in a room can be fun. Fun doesn't always mean like, yay, we killed the big monster or we won the game or whatever. So, obviously that's gonna, like Amr said, that's gonna very much depend. But I think most of us can agree, or at least speaking for myself, that being a friend thing means kind of watching out for them, kind of paying attention to them, being interested in what they're doing to whatever extent I can. And, hopefully feeling that that's being reciprocated as well. So, we always hear that like gaming is a conversation thing, but, it's a friend activity. So I think that's the way I try to approach it.
Mendes?
I don't think I have a huge amount to say that wasn't already said in the previous 2 answers, but I suppose if I'm trying to generalize like what the role of a player is across as many different games as possible, and like as many different play styles as possible, in LARPs versus tabletops, or like tactical combat heavy games versus like story or narrative games, or even stuff that's like closer to interactive theater where your role play doesn't necessarily affect like any outcomes or anything that's going on. I guess the first priority, like as a subheading under like the role of a player, is to make everybody else's experience at the table more fun. I mean, and your own, but also everybody else's. Like the first subheading going from game to game would be to figure out what behaviors are like pro-social and helpful for that particular game, and to learn as quickly, not necessarily quickly, but to figure out like what factors and what systems are in place in a game that change how you would act in a way to like benefit other people at the table. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like being pro-social in D&D and creating fun for other people is like a different process than it is in like Just a Little Oven or Mad About the Boy or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So that actually ties in really well to the next question.
Wait. Anne, are you
Yes?
going to answer the question for us as well, from your perspective? Just curious.
I wasn't planning to, but am I now being roped in?
Up to you. I am just a annoying fly speaking, but you are the host, so I'll let you do it.
Sure, I'll join in. So for me, when I tend to align with Tomer's opinion of what the role of a player is to be a good friend. And yeah, I don't know if I have anything particularly unique to say, but it really comes down to supporting other people. And at least in the games that I tend to play, they tend to be more narrative heavy. So it's about also passing on hooks, because particularly in a con environment or something like that, where you don't necessarily know people are new to the game, so they don't know the system, stuff like that. I personally am a kind of player who picks up systems extremely quickly. So it goes on to me as, because of my own skill set that I bring to the table, I therefore have to then pass on the skill set to the rest of the people at the table. So things I will do is, I have an idea for an action that can happen. I will pass it on to a different player, say, hey, here's a thing that needs to be done. Now let's spotlight you doing it in the way that you will be able of doing it. And then help build up other people at the table so that they can take a stronger narrative lead in that way. Yeah. So this is a question that I'm bringing up because I know I have a very hard time with it. How can you tell what the tone and expectation of the table is? For example, does the GM want to keep things on the rail or give more space for exploration? This is a thing that I've had difficulty both in home games and in con games, because I don't quite know how to build the conversation in a very effective way of like, how do you even begin to talk about it if you do talk about it? Like, what is the game you are playing? How do you build up that form of communication and dialogue? So let's start with Mendez.
Yeah, so I think my favorite approach to find out what the tone and the expectation of the table is to, like, if I'm coming to a new table, is to, like, early in the game or before the game, ask, so what's the tone or the expectation of this table? Like, directly, as much as possible. I think that, so sometimes when you go into a game, sometimes you know the system really well, or maybe you played the game before, and so you're familiar already with the way that in-play systems and mechanisms and even just play cultures around certain games are likely to produce a certain kind of experience. Multiple games of different games of star-crossed, say, are likely to feel kind of culturally similar in a certain way. This is not the case if you're sitting down to play Dungeons and Dragons, or like a World of Darkness, or a giant campaign LARP, something like that. Because those are kind of tentpole games in that they bring people who are having fun for different reasons together. And that's one of the reasons why they're really popular. It's because they're like jacks of all trades, masters of kind of none. Um, but it also means that you don't know what to expect when you sit down there versus like sitting down to, I don't know, like Powered by the Apocalypse or something. So I think the best way to do that is to front load like direct and obvious questions. And as early as possible, like before you start seeing like conflict and miscommunications happen, ideally, although some of them will happen, to like ask explicitly what people want and what people are doing. Because like, for example, as a player, I hate being railroaded, but if a DM sits down at the beginning and then is like, okay, this little bit of the adventure, like this next like 40 minutes, is kind of a railroad. I just want y'all to know that, and then after that, there will be more choice. Then I'll be like, yeah, sure, whatever. Um, so yeah, like getting advanced like information and consent.
Amr?
Yeah, I mean, I think the I think the easiest way is definitely having the explicit conversation about it, but that's hard if the GM is not taking point on that. Especially since there's in a lot of games the expectation that the GM is the arbiter of the table and the table culture. And so in that case, they are responsible for broaching that conversation. Um, and it can be tricky that without that conversation because it can be hard to sort of process or guess what the upper people from the table want or expect, and that can lead to clashing situations. But I think that uh, in like I think there's two certain circumstances like in an in-person game or in a home game when you are organizing it with friends or even in a place where you have more control over the organization, that's something that you should be making clear from the start of the organization. Whether you're like as a player, if you're signing up for something, you should try to reach out like, hey, I saw you're organizing for this, what are you expecting? In a con game, however, you can't really do that until you show up to the table. Most of the time you're not going to be able to talk to anyone in advance. And I think in that case, honestly, you're gonna have to try to ask the GM there, and if not, I'm not really sure. I'm entirely certain if there's much more I have to add to that at this point.
Okay. Tomer?
No, I love the comments, which are basically just like Mendez said, just talk about it, right?
Yeah.
and Amr, when you were saying, it is different when you're the GM or when you control the organizational space, right? So like, as an example in, games on demand where I'm running at the con, that's definitely something that we try to do is very much like have these conversations explicit and upfront when you're pitching the games, when you're advertising the games, and all the different components, right? Not just like, okay, well, this is what the game's about, but, is it a cognitive heavy game? Does it require a lot of rules? What's the rating level? And so this is something that I kind of started doing more and getting into practice when I was in, especially when I started playing on the Gauntlet. I know one of the things that they were really into is using cats. And Cats is something written by Patrick O'Leary. It was like a 200-word RPG, but not an RPG. And it stands for concept, aim, tone, and subject matter, right? And it's just kind of like this, let's talk about what this game is and what we're trying to achieve with it. Are we trying to win the thing and kill the thing, or just tell an interesting story, or cry in the room at the end, or what? But the tone part is huge. So nowadays when I play a game, even with close friends, like my expectation, like I used to have an expectation like, oh, we know why we're here. And I try to take that out of my head and go, okay, this is why we're here. Or, hey, what kind of story do we want to tell? Especially like Mendez says, some games are very explicit about the story. So just giving them that information up front, warns them and gets them in that space. But the games that don't tell you what kind of story to tell, you kind of want to have that conversation. So one person isn't coming in ready to be like, yeah, this is fun gonzo silliness, and the other person wants to tell the heartfelt story, especially if the two just won't work together, right? Like as far as play styles. To Amar's comment about, if you're not the GM, it is extremely difficult, right? If you're not facilitating the space, it is hard to have this conversation because then you're that person who's kind of pushing your agenda on everyone else's agenda, and you don't know if it's welcome, right? And that's, right? Does that sound about right? And I think that's difficult, right? And I've done it both in a, what I would consider like a good way and kind of like a little bit more forceful way, depending on my mood, where I was at, etc. Like I can think of a game where I sat down and it was very like OSR style game, and the GM was it was a lot more railroady. and there wasn't a lot of participation with the players. And in the middle of the game, he said one thing, which is like, oh, you see things from your home world. And he was just ready to plow on with the railroad. And I was like, no, hold on, wait, what? Like, all of us came from different places. I want to know what this player sees. I want to know what that player sees. Like, I want to play the story game here.
Mhm.
And I said that, and we did. And like, did the GM appreciate that? Maybe, maybe not, you know, but I talked to players afterwards and they were like, oh, that was great. Like, that was one of my favorite scenes. And I don't want to like be the backseat GM, but at the same time, I need to get what I want out of the game as well. So I wasn't doing it the whole game, but that scene, I was like, this is kind of my expectation, is to get this part of the, you know, the enjoyment out of the game. So sometimes you kind of have to do a little bit of that.
Actually, I'd like to jump back into a couple points off of that. One that I think even if it is hard to broach that conversation, I think more often than not, you will find that everyone on the table will benefit from at least explicitly having it. Like, even if it's hard for you to broach it, it's the whole thing where like you go through school and they're like, hey, if you have a question, don't be scared to raise your hand because like 10 other people want to ask it. It's the exact same thing, right? There's going to be at least probably have the rest of the table who want to at least know what to expect from the game, or who have assumptions and it's useful to have them clarified. And as Tomer pointed out, there's two ways to sort of go at it. One is to say, hey, what are your expectations from the game to the GM? And the other is like being a bit more forceful, like, hey, this is what I would want from the game, right? Knowing what you're comfortable with, knowing what the con expects, like, is this a space where that is the sort of thing that you are expecting, or is the GM, you know, is the GM bringing a set thing and it's not negotiable? And the other element is more important, I think, than like, or I guess for any of this to be useful, you need to start figuring out what you want as a player from a game, right? If you want to be railroaded, that's perfectly fine. You just need to know that. Like, a lot of people benefit from having that structure. A lot of people want to engage with the mechanics and want the structure to help guide the experience so that they don't struggle without the lack of structure. I know that there's a lot of situations where structure benefits me as a person. If you find the structure limiting or infuriating, that's also completely valid, and you should know that. If you're comfortable with both, that's perfectly fine. You probably don't need the conversation as much. Just the conversation would then be useful for you to find out which you should be leaning into more, right? But yeah.
Okay. So moving on, so if you could, this is one of the more broader questions I have, but I feel like it's definitely necessary to be covered in any How to Be a Better Player panel. If you had a single piece of advice for someone, like for any person whatsoever, what do you think is like the #1 piece of advice you have either developed or have gotten over the course of play that has been so fundamental on how you interact with other people?
I can go if no one else wants to.
Okay.
Easy one for me. It's kind of a continuation of what we were saying earlier, but more explicitly, it's talk about what you want, but explicitly talk about what you want in the fiction. I think that there is sort of like a push, especially in traditional, but even in story games, of like the game master or the facilitator has all these secrets and they are going to bring them up as you go through play. But talking openly as a player about the things like, hey, I have this bit of my backstory that none of your characters know about, but I want to see it pulled up in the fiction. I want you all to poke and prod at my character, make them have to confront this detail even if your characters don't know about it. Or go up to the GM and be like, hey, where's the story going? How can we, as players, lean into the direction you're taking us? How can we build up to the grand finale? That's the biggest piece of advice. Like, it's obviously not for everyone. Some people do enjoy playing a game where they're completely surprised and taken off guard, and that's perfectly fine. But for me, that enhances the player experience a lot because then I know what to do. I know that what I'm building into is factoring into the story, and it's a lot of fun to get to brainstorm with the other people explicitly what happens in the story.
Okay. Tomer?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a lot of answers there, right? But I think maybe one of the key things when learning anything, right, is just the ability to observe, right? So, you know, and because this is such a social game, because if we're talking specifically about, you know, tabletop role-playing games, and especially like story games and LARPs and things like that, it's so much of the game is how and you're interacting with these people and how they're interacting with you. So that kind of just observation and being able to ask questions, and kind of being, I guess the word is, you know, easy on yourself, or, you know, open to kind of stumbling on that journey, because a lot of us have different types of social anxiety or any of that kind of stuff. And you know, it can be difficult being in a space where you're exploring that. It could also be very open and freeing, being able to explore things that maybe in the real world or whatever, in other social situations, it's difficult to be able to play with this stuff. But that's kind of what RPGs are about, is being able to, you know, embody somebody else and kind of experiment with, you know, personality or all sorts of different things. So I would say kind of observing is maybe one of the most important things. But part of that is, I think, learning to empathize, but also like not taking things personally. And those two aren't always, you know, in sync. Like those are two very almost sometimes opposite things, right? Like when I'm empathizing with somebody and their issue, sometimes it almost makes me want to take things personally if I caused maybe, you know, something that looks like a pain that they're feeling, or, you know, or maybe I don't know if I helped cause that. And so I think, you know, being able to empathize with the other players, but also, you know, thinking of it kind of from a logical perspective to some degree of like, okay, well, how do I take that information and, you know, get to a place where we're all getting what we want out of the game without blaming myself for maybe something that I did. Instead, just how do I, you know, how do we move forward? How do we communicate? So I think that's maybe the key thing. I know for me personally, just in life, like I tend to walk into a situation and I'm not, you know, often I do try to gauge the room to some degree, right? Like that's one of my approaches. And, you know, part of it is a safety thing. You don't want to, you know, do something wrong. You don't want to look like a fool. You don't want, you know, like however you want to interpret it. There are reasons why you do it to try to feel safe, but there's also benefits to doing it where, you know, it helps you communicate more effectively with everybody, because you can kind of see, you know, where their approach is. And sometimes different people's approach, you know, or different methods of communication or kind of how socially comfortable they are, helps you understand how to communicate with them in a way that maybe works for them better, and likewise maybe works for you better. So, but that's my approach, right? I tend to be a little bit of an extrovert in some ways. I like the social stuff, except when I'm surrounded by extroverts, and then I climb up and become a total introvert. So you kind of want to know yourself and then figure out like how to be in that space where you're interacting in a way where, you know, you can kind of, I don't know, get the best out of it for you and them.
And Dust?
In Play Unsafe, Graham Walmsley wrote, don't be afraid to be boring. And that was really important to me, because the thing that sounds like it's going to be boring and obvious to you probably sounds really, really interesting to everybody else at the table. And if it doesn't, like, they probably won't notice. So,
Also,
yeah,
if I could just quickly on that, that's such a great advice. And Mendez, I'm so glad you brought that up, because like I also, when I first saw that, it was during a time where I was starting to get into these games, and, you know, you want to be interesting or bring in the thing where everyone's like, ooh, but so many times when you play a game like even like Microscope or something like that, where you're just supposed to like introduce little things, and I would just throw in an idea and I tried to embody that, just, you know, don't worry about being boring, just throw something in there. And very often that starts a snowball effect where people will take some idea from that and take it somewhere you never expected, or be really interested in it when you thought, oh, this is just a throwaway idea. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's great.
welcome.
Any other comments?
No, I mean, I'll say like as a final build off of that is just like the best thing you can bring to the table as a player is your perspective, right? And while it might seem boring to you, certain things just because you see or think that way every single day, um, it is different than everyone else at the table. Even someone who's incredibly close to you, you're going to have slightly different thought patterns and processes, and that's going to create something interesting to them, or at least will provoke them to think of something interesting.
I'm just going to add one more point to the table. This is a skill set I learned specifically off of Avery Alder and Monster Hearts, which is be interested in your player characters. But I've found like that crosses over into a fantastic player skill as well, is because it's so much easier to have fun and have other people feel supported, loved, and also more capable of having fun if you are just genuinely interested in the story that they are telling. And so just like pushing that element of like interest and passion onto the table just builds up a lot of the energy there. And it's amazing where you can go from that. So we're going to move on to a section I'm calling scenarios. These are typically these are scenarios we typically talk about from the GM's perspective, but as players, we're also involved in these type of interactions. And so it's worth considering how to interact with them in order to create a safer play environment or to remove some of the GM's burden from the table, because as a GM, you are doing so many other hats. Like sometimes it's nice to have a player come in and not be a backseat GM, but in a player's perspective, like take away some of the work. So we're focusing on that. So the first scenario I'm presenting to the table is a player has just tapped the X card. In a lot of games, the X card is used as a safety mechanic for when something is either uncomfortable or touching too close to home. It's somehow creating a space that is difficult to have fun within. And so the X card removes that kind of problem from the table. It's a quick interaction, and the way we're usually told to interact with it is when a person taps the X card, ignore it. Like just continue with the game. And that is true, you should do that, but I feel like it is also creating somewhat of a dangerous environment if we just stop the conversation completely at ignore it, trust the person to take care of themselves, when sometimes there's more nuance to the situation than just ignore it. So let's start off with Mendez. Player has tapped the X card. What do you do?
So if someone taps the X card, that means that they're uncomfortable, out of character with something that happened in the game, and they need to change that. Or that element of the game needs to change. So when someone's in a situation where they have to use that out of character mechanism, they're probably feeling a loss of like agency and control, because if they had agency or control, they would not have introduced that element, and it's usually somebody else. If I'm another player and a player next to me tap the X card, I start thinking about ways to place the agency back in that player's hands. So that could be like if there's like maybe there's like a loud conversation going on other side of the table, and this player's like wishes aren't getting respected in one way or another. So I'll raise my voice and like loudly talk over the people on the other side of the table and be like super rude to them, so that I can refocus on this person who's vulnerable. So like, because like the people who are talking loudly, they probably feel like they have agency because they're talking really loudly. So I feel comfortable like stepping on them a little bit, because this vulnerable person is in trouble. So that's one thing. And then another thing is, within the X card explanation, when a safety mechanism is explained, it's clear like what you have to do like in the moment. But I think something that we've learned from current events recently is that in addition to looking at like the systems in place that that solve problems when really bad things happen. You also have to look at like the root causes that made those problems happen in the first place. So especially as a player, where like maybe somebody else is leading on actually responding to like the incident that led to the use of a safety mechanism. So as a player, I am uniquely positioned to like sit back, be quiet if I don't need to interrupt people, and then look at the table circumstances or the play dynamics that led to this bad situation so that I can prevent it from happening again. And that could be like, that might mean that I have to like think about the interactions people are having and then ask one of those blunt questions about like, so what's the play style of this? Is there supposed to be player versus player action in this game? And so if you're in a player, if you're in a player role and like, you know, stuff's going down this heavy, you're in a unique position to notice things that need you to like step back and contemplate for a moment. So sometimes like being really like aggressive and like talking over people can be the answer. It's uncomfortable, but and then sometimes like being quiet and thinking can be the answer. And as a player, you're in a good position to do both of those things in a way that maybe the GM, or especially the person who tapped the card, is not.
Okay. Amr?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much echoing that. I think like to get a bit more, like to kind of break it down a bit, there's I feel like two extremes of circumstances that can happen when someone attacks the X card. One is the GM is super respectful, nods, retcons, moves forward. And in that case, it's super simple. Since the GM is on top of it, you as a player just have to make sure you don't repeat whatever infraction was caused. The other extreme is the GM and or the table is belligerent or ignores it or whatnot, and then you have to get rude and aggressive, as Mendez pointed out, and support the person, right? Another thing you can do is if circumstance happens again and you see the exact same situation coming up, you can X-card it yourself. It can be hard, like as a player, to repeatedly X-card the same thing, especially if it's a thing that's affecting you. Like after the first time, you just can lose the energy to make the correction a lot of the time. And so supporting the person by being like, X-card, this is the exact same circumstance, or even claiming it as your own X card or whatnot, just so that, like, if you're seeing the person as being uncomfortable with the focus being on them, you can put it onto yourself for a little bit. Some people can feel uncomfortable stopping the game or having like that sort of spotlight on them. So yeah, sort of read what is needed, as Mendes is pointing out, and just keep in mind how A, you don't repeat whatever caused the problem, and B, how you can best prevent others from ignoring or from preventing the person from feeling uncomfortable by the situation. Because I think there's an element of using the X card or equivalent safety tools which can create discomfort in of it itself, just by some people are super comfortable with having the ability to speak up for themselves, saying, hey, I'm not comfortable with this. But some people are going to be uncomfortable with having that spotlight, especially based on the table culture. Some tables, especially at cons, might not be as receptive or as supportive of someone using the X card or stopping the game, and it's a perfectly fine thing to do, but not everyone is used to it. And that can create an uncomfortable environment for someone who's trying to preserve their own safety. And so trying to either support their agency and give them a louder voice or move the spotlight a bit onto yourself, whichever they need.
Tomer?
I mean, I think what's difficult, and I think all that advice was great. I think what's difficult about the situation is that, and like you alluded to, Anne, you know, that everybody might, as the person who maybe used the X card or had the situation, might respond to that situation in different ways, or want to be responded in different ways. So some people do want to ignore, move on. Some people maybe want time to process. Some people may want to discuss the situation, etc. So that does throw a little bit of complexity in there. But if we just talk about the X card itself and kind of, let's say, you know, we've described how we're using the tool and they've used it, just because they've used it, and even if the table is reacting appropriately, doesn't always mean that magically you feel better. Like sometimes you as the person who's, you know, feeling that pain or whatever, or you know, that discomfort, you don't know what you need yet, and you're still figuring it out. And as time goes on, it may just be like, okay, yay, we moved on and I'm done, and I'm able to kind of process this later. Or maybe you're just feeling more and more uncomfortable, because I've seen that situation and talked to friends who've gone through that many times. And so sometimes as another player at the table, you know, I want to be respectful of the tool. I don't want to go in and, are you okay? Are you okay? You know, like that might be the opposite of what they want. But what I can do is I can use, you know, kind of as we alluded to, I can use my autonomy and go, you know what, I could use a break. And you can make it about yourself, sometimes as a way to, and maybe you can actually use a break, but maybe you're just noticing across the table that this person has suddenly gone withdrawn, and, you know, and we've decided to X card the thing and move on and keep playing, but maybe they need a minute, you know, and sometimes they might not feel comfortable asking for it. And I do want to give them the ability and autonomy to ask for what they need, because they'll know best. But sometimes I can use that break. So why not just go, you know what, can we take 5 minutes? I really need a break. Or can we do a bio? And sometimes you're giving that space for somebody else who may not be able to ask for it. So that's something to consider.
Okay.
Also, one other last thing I can do as a player is afterwards I can check in with the person, especially if they're close friends. Like obviously if it's someone I don't know, I don't want to maybe be too forward, or maybe they don't want to re-examine that thing. But if they look upset, I might go, hey, you know, if you want to talk, I'm here. Or you open the door for that conversation if you feel, as the player, you feel comfortable, you know, being that person. I mean, we're not therapists either, but like we can't be friends, right? So
The next scenario, you are at a table where there is a very large personality and then a smaller one who might be getting less spotlight. You might even be one of those two individuals in question. How do you create a shared spotlight? So let's start off with Tomer.
Obviously, like some of the maybe it's not that simple. Some of the simple stuff is involve them and involve yourself in their stories, right? So, you know, in their narrative, sure. I guess, you know, if you feel like it's you, because you're jumping in there and being the large personality, for example, a lot of times involving, because there are players who do like to kind of watch the show a little bit, or not necessarily be front and forward, or be just part of the team. So if you're going to be large, like, you know, maybe involve all that stuff in the largeness, right? Like it doesn't have to be a story just about your character, obviously, right? It's not. But if you already feel like, ooh, I'm feeling very, you know, forward and social and funny and witty and whatever, that's cool. But when you're doing it with their information and about them and their story, then they become part of that large personality, right? So I would say maybe that's one way to go. If you're the smaller personality, and I've been there many times as well, there's a couple of directions, you know, and especially if they're not sharing, or if some subset of the group is not sharing that spotlight, and maybe the GM is not able to, or the facilitator isn't able to distribute it well. You know, trying to speak up, of course, and all that stuff. But one option is you can decide to shift your expectations of the game. Maybe I was here to play and win this thing, but now I'm just gonna, you know what, sit back and observe and kind of be entertained. Or now I'm gonna try to learn the rules and I'm gonna get something out of it. That's one approach. It's not always my favorite approach, because then I don't feel like I'm having the fun. I feel like I'm there doing just some subset of what I want to do. But there's also that open door policy, and you know, not everybody talks about that ahead of time, but like if you're really not having fun at that table, you can always bounce out. And I know one strategy of that is, oh, I got a work call, sorry, gotta go, it's an emergency, the family. You know, you can do the pure lying thing, especially if you don't feel comfortable telling the truth in this group, because we don't always feel that way. But another way is just, you know what, guys, have that conversation. I'm actually not that into this game, or I'm not having a good time, and maybe it's just me, you know, I'm gonna bounce out. You guys can do whatever you want with my character, or, you know, or just stop and have the conversation if you feel comfortable with them, and see how you can be involved, right?
Mendes?
Um, I like to use like side sessions and like taking people aside in those situations. Um, so like if it's an ongoing game and there's a player who you haven't um, and there's a player who hasn't like gotten to contribute a lot, like sometimes I'll be like, hey, can we do like a quick like 30-45 minute scene, like just our characters in between sessions, um so like we can like forge some connections and like get to know each other a little bit better. Sometimes you don't have time for that, but if you can, then like next time you come back, you and they are better positioned to like present a sort of a united front. um if you've ever done like gigantic campaign LARPs, or like even just like really big like one-shot LARPs where like all of the loud hype, like all of the really loud energetic people are like right there in the middle of the action and the GMs are just paying attention to them, and then there's like a bunch of quiet people sitting by the wall who are getting completely ignored. You can like look around, like find who in the room looks like they're really sad or like is like doom scrolling their phone, and like just go over to them and be like, I'm just gonna artificially create like plot and play between us, because otherwise that's clearly not happening. um yeah.
Okay. Amr?
Yeah, I think to build off on that advice, I think that works no matter which of the circumstances you find yourself in, whether you find yourself as the loud one, the quiet one, or someone else at the table. If you're the loud one, you can, as Tomer pointed out, rope people in, right? Use the fact that you have sort of this presence that's taking the spotlight to share that spotlight by pulling people into your shenanigans. Directly prompt them. Don't force them into situations they're comfortable with, but be like, hey, you know, my character approaches you with this, or hey, are you cool if I rope you into this scene? Give them the opportunity to back out if they're not comfortable being there, but give them the in, create that in. If you find yourself as someone in the middle, then yeah, as Mendes pointed out, you can go find the quieter players and create interactions between you all so that there's shared scenes there. And if you find yourself as the quiet player, you can sort of do the reverse. Now, if you find yourself as the quiet player, you might be uncomfortable approaching the loud presence, or you might find them unapproachable for a variety of reasons, whether they're just intimidating or they're kind of taking over the spotlight without sharing it, or whatnot. But you can still then find some of the medium players and create an in there, attaching your character to theirs in some way or another. They're comfortable with that is a great way to force yourself into the fiction so you can't be pushed out of the story.
Okay. And then moving on to our last question. The game is not going the way you expected. This might be you started off in the middle of a game and it's going in a direction that you didn't expect it, or at some point you had an expectation of play which got transformed into something else. And what do you do then? And how does this change in a con game versus a home game? Let's start with Mendes.
Yeah, this is cool. This is also a question that we got in the group chat earlier.
Yes.
So that's cool. Okay. If it's a con game and the style is like a radical departure from what I intended, I have to do some calculus in terms of like, if I leave this game now, like, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And is there going to be like someone around to hang out with me, so I'm not just kind of alone and grumpy, like in the hotel lobby or something like that? And like, I might decide that like for my own like emotional safety, or just like my own enjoying the afternoon, I would actually prefer to sit here at this table and then type snarky things to my friends over Messenger as I suffer through the game. And I think of it as an experience where like, yeah, this is going to be bad, but I can tell stories and complain about it later. And I really enjoy complaining and being petty sometimes. So, and this is also a great way, at least for me, to make sure that my behavior is good at the table. Because if I'm frustrated and there isn't really like a productive, easy way to like communicate or be direct, or like if asking people to change things hasn't worked, I can prevent myself from becoming terrible by telling myself, no, I'm not going to be negative to these people right now. instead, I promise myself that I will be very, very negative to my friends who like hearing me complain later. And that might seem like a petty choice, because it also is. But um, it can also be a pro-social thing because like you're giving yourself space and making yourself a promise that's gonna make the play experience better because maybe the other people at the table really are enjoying like the GM's Railroad or whatever.
Okay. Amr?
Yeah, I think it's a lot harder when it is a con game. You know, like if it's halfway through a 3 hour, 4 hour block, and you've only got an hour and a half left. It might not always be worth it to have that conversation, especially if the rest of the table's having fun. You can do what Tomer mentioned earlier of like just getting up and leaving, or you can do what Mendes just pointed out of just
Mm-hmm.
toughing it out, being petty. Obviously, you know, figure out how much you are not enjoying it, how much you are willing to adapt or not willing to adapt, and how much you're willing to be petty later if you so wish. Um, but in a longer game, obviously, that's not like that's something you're probably doing with your own free time, with your own free volition. There is very few reasons to subject yourself to that repeatedly once you realize it's no longer fun. Um, and
Yeah, this
like,
is hopefully it's not happening in your campaign game.
yeah, right. Um, if you're having a bad time at a game, remember it's a hobby, right? It's a hobby you're doing for fun to enjoy yourself. And if you're not doing that, then its function as a hobby is probably failing. Um, but and I like speak from personal experience. I had a game recently which actually had this exact same scenario where mid-game we sort of shifted our focus a little. We started off playing a like What We Do in the Shadows sitcom style game, as all vampires living in an apartment. And the game stayed the same, but the tone of what the individual sessions was going to, we switched from like single session sitcom scenarios to some more plots being woven in, which was fun for a little bit, but it wasn't what I wanted from the game. It wasn't what I signed up for. And like by the third or fourth time in a row of not having the original sitcom premise, I was starting to zone out a bit. And so after that like session ran on to the end, I basically sat down, pulled out a notepad on my laptop, and just typed out everything I wanted to say, deleted it all, typed it out again, and then when the next time we met, we were going to talk about the game because we had been like off for a bit, and I just read out everything that I'd written down about. Hey, here's what I enjoyed about the game. Here's why I have not been connecting as much, and here's why y'all have been noticing me dissociating from the game a little bit recently. Here's what I would like to see. Here's at least the start of the steps I think would take it in the direction that's more interesting for me. Let's talk about it. And I was lucky, you know, everyone there was my friend. Everyone there sort of started seeing the problems as well and agreed, and it worked out. Obviously, it won't always. Sometimes they might be like, actually, hey, no, we're really all enjoying this, you know. Um, in that case, you know, one, I would say find friends who are willing to accommodate your interests, and two, um, like that's perfectly fine. Then maybe that's just not the game for you, right? Like maybe you just step back from the game and let the friends enjoy it. But um, yeah, talking about it openly, coming with here's why it bothered me, here's the stuff I've enjoyed when we first signed up, here's what I think can bring it back to that is a sort of great template for that.
And Tomer?
Yeah, I think I mean that was all covered beautifully. I think when it comes down to it, part of being a good player and being a good anything is just understanding and learning who you are in the context of that thing, right? So like getting to that point where you know, what am I comfortable sharing and not sharing with these people, and you know, how close are they to me? So when I see con game versus home game, for example, what I'm seeing is people I don't really know and maybe trust versus like people who maybe I trust more. So if I put it in those two kind of like buckets. And part of what's going to make it easy to like, if the game's not going as expected, am I feeling comfortable, you know, taking charge or doing something about it? Was that trust built up ahead of time? That's part of why in con games, a lot of times we see like these different tools being used as a way of saying like, you know what, we don't know each other that well, but this is how we can build a little bit of trust here, you know, at the table. And so if I don't feel that trust, then yes, know yourself and know, you know, if this is actively causing you like non-enjoyment, right, then do something about it, right? And yeah, if that could be being very open and honest and saying, sorry, I'm not enjoying it, bye. Or it could be like, yep, there's an emergency call, as we talked about before. with your friends, hopefully it does come up, and it's not necessarily easier. I've had a lot of conversations recently with friends who are playing stream games or home games or things like that. And, you know, they're having a blast those first 2 sessions, and then suddenly you aren't feeling that into it, or maybe it's not making you feel the way you want, and it's kind of playing with your head, and everybody else is having a great time. So like, do you speak up? Everyone seems to be enjoying it so much, even though you're not. And usually that's like a slow road where it's not like you immediately know what's going on. Sometimes you need a minute or a couple sessions to start figuring out like, yeah, this is really not enjoyable. And so being able to speak up to your friends and go like, this thing you're really enjoying, I'm not, that's hard. It is hard. But hobefully that's a moment of growth, not just for yourself, but for the group in question and for your relationships. And yeah, it's a hobby that you're hopefully doing for fun. So keep finding that fun.
Okay,
Also,
and with that,
can I add one last thing?
go for it.
Sorry. I'll say that like if they're your friends, like even if they are enjoying themselves, I found from experience that they enjoy themselves more when you are all enjoying yourselves. Like your friends are not going to want to enjoy themselves at the expense of you, right? So you know, keep that in mind if you. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
With that, we are wrapped. We are out of time and slightly over, just a little bit. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for our panelists for donating their time. Hopefully you learned something. And with that, have a good rest of the day.